I wanted to do a tier list talking about the new state of Modern. Modern has now kind of slowly stabilized after the bannings, and we're kind of starting to see it slowly cement itself. And once we get to the RC season for Modern, we're probably going to have an idea of what kind of decks are going to be around. And so, for people who are interested, I am very happy to make another tier list to basically show what you should be expecting, and if these are what's to be expected, how well are you favored if you're looking to play Fish? Because honestly, Merfolk looks like a very solid deck in this next RC season. All right, let's start off with kind of like the easy matchups for Fish because I think it's really important to just say what you're good against. It's prime time. This is the buy for Fish. And I guess one thing I should clarify before I actually get into it is that when I say the buy for Fish, I'm not saying that's like always going to be winning. Obviously, Magic is a game with a lot of variance. So sometimes even the really, really good matchups you can lose, and even the really bad, bad matchups you can win, and vice versa. And just to kind of clarify the tiers is that slightly unfavored means that like a lot of your main deck tools are already very proficient against this strategy, and you'll have a positive win rate against these matchups over like the long course of a bunch of games. Even you can kind of interpret it 50-50, can go either way. Slightly unfavored, essentially slightly favored, but the opposite. A lot of your tools don't really line up with it. You kind of have to draw in a very sequential manner in order to actually beat these matchups. You have to make sure that you have everything on time when you need it. And with unfavored, it's just basically a miserable matchup that you don't really have any real prospects of winning. So with those tiers kind of clarified now, this gets me into the buy for Fish. Primetime, Amulet Titan is a really easy matchup. This is actually truly one of the actual buys for Merfolk because every single one of your tools are just amazing against this deck. Your Flare of Denial, your Force of Negation, get rid of the Amulet of Vigor. Your subtleties are able to deal with the prime time when they are able to make it uncounterable. Tishana's Tidebinder can like turn it off even if they resolve it if you don't have counter spells. And Harbinger of the Seas basically just being GG against them. Being a deck with four Harbingers are just like GG. And even when they play Dryad of the Elysian Grove, it turns off like a beatdown, turns on a beatdown plan with Lord of Atlantis. So a lot of experienced Amulet Titans would probably agree that Fish is a really, really bad matchup, but they don't worry about it because it's not super common. So the next one is Blue Black Frog. You know, the Blue Black uh, Reanimator style variants, whichever kind of one that they like to go. It's really good for you. It's really, really, really good. Uh, I think that a deck with nothing but a bunch of counter spells inside of its deck is already a really inherently favored matchup for Merfolk because you're a deck that can play from 4 to 2 Cavern of Souls. I think 4 is currently like a really good number to have, and you play 4 vials. It's going to have a really tough time because they're going to have hands often that look like land, cantrip, counterspell, force negation, and a frog. And that's not super uncommon for them to have. And so they'll draw counterspell, spell snare, stern scolding, mystical dispute, even after sideboarding because they won't have enough removal to bring in. And the removal suite isn't really that extensive. It usually goes from 4 Fatal Push, 2 Doomblade style effects, and maybe a Toxic Deluge or two, which is okay, but not enough to really like keep up with the amount of creatures that you have and can easily get overwhelmed. And Psychic Frog can be easily locked down with everything that you have in the matchup. So that's kind of like my general assessment about the Blue Black Frog list and how the games will go. Goryo's Vengeance. The Esper variants and the Mardu variants are both very favored. A general rule of thumb is that if a deck needs a certain spell to resolve in order to actually win the game, these are matchups that are good for you because of the fact that you have the free counter magic. So that's just something to keep in mind that if they need something specific to resolve in order to win the game, you'll have no problem with it. But if they have a wide, varied amount of spells that can kind of mid range you out, that's where you'll struggle a fair bit. Dredge. So this is a weird matchup. You obviously will have a pretty tough time game one, as most decks do. I don't think this matchup is unwinnable, and I don't even think it's slightly favored. It definitely gets a lot easier post sideboard. So I would say that you are slightly unfavored game one, and then game two and three you have a very even matchup with them because of your graveyard hate, your relics, your unlicensed hearse, your ghost vacuums, your leyline of the voids, whichever one you kind of decide to have in your sideboard. I actually believe that the dredge matchup is quite even, and surprisingly enough, Harbinger of the Seas is pretty good against them because that means they can't cast their cathartic reunions or Oxylagonus. The only thing that they can really use is otherworldly gaze. So that's something to kind of think about when you're playing this matchup is that games are played even after game one. It would be nice if it was just game one, but they're sideboard games, so it makes Dredge even. Same thing with Storm. You're very much slightly favored. I would argue that you still probably need some dedicated pieces to really make this like the buy, but your tools already line up pretty well. Vidalian Hexcatcher is always going to be fantastic because just a force spike for every Merfolk, Flare, Force, Graveyard Hate, pretty easy time to be able to take it with them. So the next matchup is Hollow One. I think this matchup is pretty tough for Merfolk even after sideboarding. It comes really down to the iteration of your list that you have, but even like a Burning Inquiry into two Hollow Ones, while not impossible to beat for other decks because they have removal like Leyline and Unholy Heat and Galvanic Discharge and blocks with Bolt, we don't have that. So if they just play like a 4/4 on turn one, that's already pretty tough because we're just going to be playing Vile and we're going to be really far behind. And then turn two, we play like a Merfolk, even though it's a Merfolk that can tap something down, you're still dealing with a lot of stuff that's in the air. And even though you can kill the Nether Goyf and deal with the Arclight, or excuse me, the Detective's Phoenix, you're still getting put under a lot of pressure. And the game gets better for you the longer it goes because your creatures will outscale them, but you probably won't have time to get there. Uh, Burn, slightly favored. Uh, you can kind of deal with a lot of the early onslaught of damage with Goblin Guides and Monastery Swift Spears through the tapping creatures, but you also have just counter spells to kind of negate some of the damage that they are able to do. Burn's kind of honest. It's either that they are able to burn through you or they're not able to close out those last points of damage, and your creatures will outscale them. And more experienced burn players will kind of have to use your burn spells on your creatures and kind of play like a prowessy tempo game, which makes it kind of hard because that means they can't really close out the game with their burn spells anymore and then are reliant on their creatures to close it out, which are kind of bad in the long term as they scale worse and worse throughout the game. Indomitable Creativity, another matchup that is just really, really, really good for Merfolk. I'm almost tempted to put it in the buy, uh, honestly, just because Harbinger of the Seas is extremely good against this card. It just basically negates it. Negates the entire strategy because triple red is a huge requirement. They need a lot of their non-basics to be able to create their tokens because I don't believe that they actually no, excuse me. Fable of the Mirror Breaker. They don't have many other ways to produce a non-creature card, or excuse me, a token card that's a non-creature spell. Uh, so that makes it really good. And plus, you play Force and Flare, and then after sideboarding, they do have Veil of Summer and discard, but a Resolved Archon actually isn't even that big of a deal against your deck because you're able to go right through it. A lot of the times an Archon of Cruelty is all about getting out early and then making sure your opponent can't really recover because it gets to attack. But you're able to tap it down, keep it locked down. Flood Pit's Drowner is able to shuffle it away. Trickster is able to keep it locked down for a turn, and also you're getting in for damage. And the deck doesn't run as much removal as I thought. It's only like four push, and then maybe like a bolt or two. But it doesn't have an insane amount of removal because Archon of Cruelty usually is the removal that needs to resolve. So, once again, spells that require resolving are pretty tough for Merfolk. Or, excuse me, pretty tough or pretty easy for Merfolk. Hardened Scales. Hardened Scales is pretty unfavorable just because their creatures are really hard to interact with. A hangerback walker that is just amassing a huge amount of counters, and then when it dies, it just makes a bunch of flying bodies that we can't deal with. Walking Ballista being able to ping down all of our creatures and get stupidly huge with the scales. Our counter magic doesn't really line up with anything that they do. The only thing that we'll ever be able to force is like a hardened scales, or maybe when they cast one of their Urza Saga targets. But otherwise, they'll be able to put them into play. So that's something that is pretty tough for Merfolk to deal with. Uh, there are a lot of tools that you have. Now, this will be something that'll come up as well with Yagmoth, but this could actually be turned into a favorable matchup depending on your sideboard pieces. If you play Cursed Totem or some sort of green variant with Collector Oof, you can easily make this a very favorable matchup. But as of now, current standard Merfolk builds don't run like that, so you probably won't have a good time. But if you're finding that you have a lot of creature-based combo, feel free to run Cursed Totem to make this matchup better. This is not like an end-all be-all, because a lot of Merfolk can be sort of swapped around based on your actual build, but this is for the most part a very general sense of how Merfolk will fare against your average build. Okay, but yeah, but that being said, Hardened Scale is kind of tough, lots of creatures, hard to interact with outside of Tidebinder being our only good tool. uh, Through the Breach, whether it's the Is It variants or the green red Utopia Sprawl variants, it's good for you. They need to resolve a 5 mana instant, which even though they can do it at the end of your turn to play around force, you still have Flare of Denial, which breaks a lot of timing restrictions, so they can play around one, get caught by the other, and vice versa. And if they try to just play like a normal ramp plan, Harbinger, Tideshaper are really strong in order to enable the ability to disable their ability to just ramp out lots of big Eldrazi, even if they are just trying to cheese you out with Through the Breach. So Underworld Breach is a matchup that I've played a lot against. It's really strong, honestly. And the more that I've given it some thought, it's actually super favored. Uh, at first, I was kind of concerned because the deck is really fast and does get under you. It definitely can just combo out on turn 2, turn 3 even. And if you're a deck with no agency, then that will be pretty rough. But we have Force of Negation, Flare of Denial. You'll definitely get like the sense that if they need to resolve Underworld Breach, you can just counter it. And Vidalian Hexcatcher also helps in this regard because you can make their mana a lot harder to use. Harbinger of the Season, extremely powerful card against this matchup too, even though Mox Opal is a card that kind of can invalidate her. It's only one red, and what they generally need is a little bit more than that. So if you're able to like sink into the stupor and back to their hand, that's basically a time walk. And even their Mox Amber isn't able to produce the colors that they need, because for the most part, most builds don't run a red legendary. Some could have Ragavan. And Ragavan does change the dynamic of the matchup, could make it even worse. But most don't run Ragavan, so for the average build, you're very slightly favored because they need to resolve Underworld Breach through a lot of counter magic and a fast clock and Harbinger, so they can't go on a fair beatdown plan, which can also be taken care of with Merfolk, Trickster, and Flintpit's Jounder to make sure that you can stem the bleeding from big constructs. And for the rest of the deck, it's kind of dirtly. You don't really give a shit about the fact that they're like looping Mistress Baubles and looping garbage cards. You're just like kind of wanting to smash face, and they don't have that much removal. It's just like 3 or 4 Unholy Heats, and that's kind of it. And you're getting a sense of the fact that if the deck runs less removal, you'll always have a better time because more creatures, more punch in the face. Yagmoth, pretty bad matchup. This is the same deal with Hardened Scales. This can definitely be turned to a very slightly favorable matchup if you just decide to play Cursed Totem and actually deal with a lot of their activated abilities and make sure when Yagmoth hits, it's not just like an end of the end of the game because they're able to snipe off your entire board with a Patra and draw a bunch of cards and guarantee that you can never get back into the game. That being said, I do think that in general, your average hands won't line up very well, and you're really relying on Harbinger of the Seas to lock them out of their black mana to make sure that Yagmoth isn't able to resolve, and your tools won't ever be very good because of the fact that Delighted Halfling can basically invalidate a good chunk of your disruptive elements, and that card is just brutal for us because of the fact that if you're a frog player and you know how it's like to be in front of a Cavern of Souls, it's basically that same thing. You will never be able to play a good chunk of your deck that is really imperative to making sure your opponent doesn't get ahead of you. So Flare of Denial is useless because now you can't really use it on Grist, which is a big deal, or Yagmoth, which is also a big deal. And then Agathis Soul Cauldron is just forced through. So once they start sacrificing stuff, they get more activated abilities, and it becomes really hard for you to deal with. And Court of Calling can play around Force of Negation's timing restrictions in a much better way than other spells. So yes, there's a lot of tools that they have that are really tough and you don't line up very well with. Your only hope is that you dealt enough damage by the time that Yagmoth resolves. It is not really that big of a deal. All right, Splinter Twin. So I haven't seen much Splinter Twin, but Splinter Twin is a deck that I love, but sadly, it is the buy for Merfolk. Same dealio as the Frog decks is that you kind of just get, or you just kind of run over them. They have counter spells. They play just like bolts and galvanic discharges, which is a lot of removal, to be fair. 8 pieces of removal, up to 10 maybe if they decide to play Unholy Heat, but I haven't really seen that. They need to resolve a 4 mana enchantment that is sorcery speed, and also hope that the creature can actually tap. Not very useful, not very good. Sadly, Splinter Twin does get run over by Merfolk. So the next matchup is Eldrazi Ramp. I will put this in the same tier as Slightly Favored just because of the fact that it's a deck that just relies on trying to get as much mana out as possible. You have Harbinger, you have Tideshaper, you have Subtleties and Consign to Memories to deal with a lot of the stuff that they're doing. And they can't really overwhelm you that quickly. The only concern for you is just if they are able to get a game 1 Kozilek's return, which can be pretty rough because that can kind of spell the name of the game for you. And as long as you don't really overextend too hard into it, and you're aware of it, then it shouldn't be that much of an issue. So next up is Rhinos. Depending on whatever version that they're using, Rhinos is also kind of like a matchup that isn't necessarily impossible to beat. Sometimes they'll just kind of have fast starts that can kind of overwhelm you, but I would put this at even. A lot of your interaction is really useful against them. With Flare and Force to be able to deal with the Ardent Plea cascading into Crashing Footfalls. And as long as you're able to counter the Footfalls, that'll be really rough. And even if you can't counter it, you still have your Tempo Bears that are able to stem the bleeding. And a lot of these decks do have a blue base, so you're able to island walk right through them and always have it on innately. Harbinger is always a really good card. And even the really busted starts of Leyline of the Guild Pact into Scion of Draco into Crashing Footfalls isn't that big of a deal because you can race it if you have like lots of like lords and lots of powerful creatures to back it up. It only really gets hard if they have lots of efficient 1 mana removal, which they'll probably have with Dead Gone and Leyline of the Guild, or excuse me, Leyline of the Leyline Binding. So next matchup is Belcher. I haven't seen much Belcher, but it's still kind of the same way as I think it's Slightly Favored. It can definitely easily go up in the buy depending if you're a lot more suited for it, but it's a matchup that can definitely just be really easy to beat up on because you have so much good interaction. You know, Flare of Denial, Force of Negation, Cavern of Souls, and Tishana's Tidebinder and Consign to Memory. Like, these are all cards that you're going to be playing in your 75, so you can easily just run over this deck. And if their counter spells are invalidated, it just kind of means that they'll have more counters when they try to go for the big climactic turn, for when they try to kill you. Uh, it just, that's essentially it. And you might lose the counter war, but they ended up spending a lot of resources, and if they don't have the extra mana, you do just have the potential to kill them. Tishana's Tidebinder is also just like literally the best card in this matchup. It is literally unbeatable for them. If you just go an uncounterable Tidebinder or a Violin Tidebinder on an activation, they literally can't do anything about it. It is nothing that they can do. And also, they're a deck that plays Harbinger, which is not very useful. Okay, so we're finally getting to the matchups that are pretty bad for Merfolk. I just see a slew of bad matchups after this. So Basking Brute Scale, pretty tough. You have a hard time interacting with like their early creatures. You don't really have the best way to turn off activated abilities. And if they just go this really fast start when they go, you know, Blade of the Blood Chief, turn 1, turn 2, Basking Brute Scale, turn 3, equip and activate that, and they have like a mana engine or a mana payoff, then that's his game, and you never really had any agency towards it. Even if you counter the payoff, they still just have like an infinitely huge Brute Scale, and even if you tap it down, that's not dealing with the problem long term, because you're just gonna be forced to chump every single time, which means that you're getting put behind on board, which inadvertently would lead you to lose. So this matchup is kind of tough. Harbinger can sort of do some work, but they can play around it. They don't need their colorless mana. It's only really a big deal for Kozilek's Command, which is a really good card, but it's not imperative to their ability to win. And as long as they just kind of force through the combo over and over again, you'll have to deal with it. And even though they play Delighted Halfling, they won't actually have any ways to make it uncounterable, but they do play Veil, and Consign to Memory can be okay in this matchup. So it can kind of go either way, but the deck's a little fast for you. So finally, our first very unfavored matchup, Prowess. And whatever flavor of it they decide to do, it is a really, really, really tough time to be able to play against this matchup, because they just have lots of really efficient one mana removal that just kills all your little guys. Lava Dart, even though it doesn't kill too much, it just helps to make the math and the blocks even worse for you. Lightning Bolt, any ways to just get rid of creatures while also beating down for like 4, 5, 6, and 7, and 10 is just really tough. And they're able to use Underworld Breach in a way that's not just instantly win the game, but like it's going to put you in a really, really terrible position because you can't deal with how efficient everything is. Pretty tough. Even after sideboarding, there's not a whole lot that you can do to make this matchup even better. You're just simply going to get run over. So another matchup that's not super great is Hammer. Hammer is a pretty tough matchup. It kind of even comes down to what builds you're going to, and this matchup could be made to be a little bit more even, but it's simply just you're gonna get run over by a really fast Ornithopter or a Pure Steel Paladin start, and there's not much you can do about it other than just keep tapping it down or hope that you had the counterspell that lined up pretty well with it. But they also can just play the fair beatdown plan with Saga, and even though you have Tide Shaper and Harbinger, they still have plenty of ways to get through your counterspells with Stoneforge Mystic and being able to flash it in at any point with Sigarda's Aid. It makes it really hard for you to use your mana at your own pace. You're always at what they want to do. So it's going to be pretty tough a lot of the time for you. And tempo bears aren't always going to be the answer, because you'll always have to make sure that you block, because they might have the second hammer to flash in, or can just instantly make it a 20/20. So next matchup, 4 color. This one's actually pretty easy. I think that this might be a little bit contentious amongst Merfolk players, but I believe this is a very favorable matchup. I think Solitude, while being very annoying for you, can be dealt with quite easily, and Harbinger of the Seas is just basically good game against this deck. And even if they're able to play around it, a lot of the basics that they fetch out first aren't removal colors often. They tend to be the forest and plains first. And while they can definitely have a prismatic ending, a lot of builds vary very much in how they will play. So Solitude, prismatic ending kind of being like their only outs, and a 4 mana leyline binding, or if they preemptively got some basics, uh, it allowed them to get a cheaper leyline binding. It's still pretty tough for them, even though a lot of their removal is exile based, so Sveilun won't be as useful. You'll still have a lot of really good tools that are must deal with the Harbinger, so you're able to just outgrind this deck, out tempo them, and then just kind of hammer them in, as they are a naturally blue mana base as well. Okay, so here it is, the worst matchup of all time. This is so the way that prime time feels for us against them. It's just like easy as fuck. They don't even have to think about it. You just like press buttons, slap down cards, and win. That's what it's like for Boros Energy. This is probably one of the worst matchups ever in Modern's history. It is just horrible. You have no agency over what they do. You can't stop anything what they do. They will always run you over. You don't really have much of a say. The removal lines up extremely well with what you're doing. The removal also helps their ability to get in for more damage, and it also allows them to create more creatures. And not only that, but when they're making more creatures, they're gaining life, which means that you have a harder time punching through damage. So even if you're dealing like 13 a turn, they can definitely just make that completely invalid. So that being said, it is a really bad matchup, and especially as they've gotten more creature heavy with Seasoned Pyromancer and Phalia and other variants, it's gotten even harder because they can blink your vial, they can deal with a lot of your stuff. It's a tough time to be a Merfolk enjoyer if you're trying to play into a lot of energy. Same thing with Mardu. It's still pretty bad. These are all the same principles with Mardu, but the caveat being is that they are a lot more susceptible to being just like cheesed out with Harbinger. So this one might have a little bit of a better chance because of it, but it's still a lot of the same principles for Boros. That guide plus Ocelot Pride and efficient removal is going to be really tough for you to deal with. And then not only that, but Orcish Bowmasters is a tough card for you to deal with because it invalidates a lot of your ability to get in and do some damage. Mill, pretty favorable. They're a blue deck. There's no one spell that you have to counter. I guess that could be the Tasha's Hideous Laughter. But Tasha's Hideous Laughter isn't super great because a lot of our deck is actually pretty high in CMC. So it'll, on average, tend to mill like 10 cards because Sink into the Stupor, Glasspool Mimic, Subtlety, Force Negation, Flare. We have a lot of 3-drops, essentially. So the 3-drops and the 2-drops will add up pretty quickly. We're not very heavy on 1 or 0s. That being said, if they have like a crab start, that'll be pretty tough for you to deal with. A lot of decks kind of can struggle with the crab start, but more so for us because we can't get rid of them. And yeah, Mill can just kind of sometimes beat you by just playing a lot of crabs. Jeskai Control, same kind of dealio. It is a blue deck with not a whole lot of a clock, and that's always like the big thing about Merfolk is that it doesn't matter how much removal your deck has. Even though Wrath of the Skies is pretty strong against us, they play Wrath of the Skies, Supreme Verdict, Galvanic Discharge, Leyline Binding, Prismatic Ending, Flage. All that doesn't really matter unless it's backed up by a clock. Now, in Jeskai's case, the clock is Tameo. As it's upticking after the Inquisitive student flips into... I actually don't know what she flips into. Basically, she's threatening to draw half the deck. That is the clock that you have to deal with. Outside of that, there's not a whole lot because Flage can be dealt with a lot easier than you'd normally would expect with subtlety and sink into the stupor and just tempo bears to tap it down. The deck doesn't pressure you a whole lot, so you get a lot of time to set up your Aether Vials, your mana engines, and beat down with really cheap and efficient creatures that they don't want to kill, because it'll be often the case where they'll just be really worried about wanting to get max value out of their wraths and etc. Because your creature deck, you can just slowly kind of deploy creatures at your own pace, and they'll have to deal with them when you want them to. And when they are tapping out to deal with these really problematic creatures that are, even though kind of useless, they have to deal with them because otherwise they'll die. Meaning that Jeskai is a pretty good matchup because when they tap out, it lets you resolve Harbinger. Domain is a matchup that is pretty can go sort of either way. Sometimes they can have these really strong starts where they go like a turn one Ragavan into a turn two Kavu, and then they have Bolt to back it up, or Leyline Binding to make sure that you can't really get on board as fast. And it can be tough if they have those sort of starts, but at the same time, you also have your Harbinger starts, and Merfolk Trickster is really good against Territorial Kavu and Leyline, or excuse me, Scion of Draco, because you can turn off a lot of the really strong abilities that allows them to be able to do what they do. Ragavan being a mainstay of the deck now is kind of hard for you, because locking them out of their mana and inadvertently making their making their mana, or turning off their land types, can't always be a super viable strategy as much, even though they can fetch basics in response to the Harbinger and also have the ability to have all 5 colors with Leyline of the Guild Pact. Tideshaper is able to kind of make sure that you don't let them do that, so their domain is always kind of weak. So you have a lot of tools to be able to make sure that domain is not always online, but Ragavan can always be a problem because you have to deal with it early. So where would I put that? It can kind of go either way. Some people have told me that this is kind of slightly favored, and I would be inclined to agree that it's slightly favored, but I think it's just even. I don't think like going into it you're immediately favored. You just have innate chances just to win, but it can definitely go either way. So next match is this new deck that has been popping up, this blue-white blink deck, and for those who are not familiar, it is kind of just a blue-black mid-range deck with Ephemery. It uses lots of blink value with Orcish Bowmasters, Tight Hollow Sculler, and it just basically tries to make you get drowned in value based on all the ETBs. This matchup is off the cuff, just looking at it. It is terrible for Merfolk. It is a really, really, really bad time just from off the looks of it. And you definitely would have no chance beating a deck like this, especially if they just keep playing their... Okay, so another matchup that I forgot to actually include is Affinity. I haven't seen too much Affinity. I have played against it. It's pretty easy. I wouldn't say you're favored or anything like that, but it can kind of go either way. Sometimes they'll have their really fast starts and just run you over, and then just have, you know, Opal Bobble, and all this other stuff, and just put out a turn 2 Kappa Cannoneer and then just beat you down with an unblockable Ward 4 guy. But sometimes they'll also just have really dirtly draws where they just kind of play Emery and then just keep flashing back a Bobble, and you don't really care because you just play a Harbinger. So the Urza Saga, a big part of how they win games is just basically null and void, and you just kill them because they're also an innately blue deck. And final matchup, I guess, to include is the Mirror. I would say it is very unfavored because you have to kill one of your own kind. But if you have any questions or thoughts and opinions, or if you think I'm completely wrong about this, feel free to leave a comment and tell me what you think each individual tier should be placed. And if you have any questions about how I came up with like my methodology to how to actually like, or how I came up with the methodology to interpret how matchups can go, I will leave a link in the description below for you can actually see how I came up with it and how I determine each individual matchup.